A clinical romance. The new patient was a big, thick-chested man, 23 or so, and he didn't look sick at all. But the moment he tiptoed into the admitting ward and headed for the empty bed beside Frank Garvey's during quiet hour one June afternoon, Garvey could tell he was a repeat case. First-time patients looked shy in the hospital pajamas as they walked or were wheeled into the long high room. They would glance about uneasily at the rows of horizontal men in tussled sheets, the sputum cups and Kleenex boxes and photographs of wives before they yielded tentatively to the fresh bed that was to be their own. And usually they started asking questions right away. How long you've been here? 18 months? No, but I mean, how long is it for the average cure? But this one knows his way around. A couple of the old timers in the rear of the ward were waving and grinning at him, which proved it. Observing the rules of the quiet hour, he put his folded clothes in the bedstand with elaborate care to avoid noise. Then, seeing Garvey was awake, he offered his hand across the space between their beds. No point waiting for a formal introduction, he said in a whisper, and with a boy's smile that broke the tight Irish toughness of his face. My name's Tom Lynch. Frank Garvey, glad to know you. Been here before? 15 months the first time. Then I got fed up and signed out. That was 5 months ago, he smiled again. I had a 5-month vacation. Miss Baldridge, the charge nurse, broke it up with a shrill command from the door that jolted several other men awake. All right, Lynch, let's cut the talking and get into that sack. You know better than to come blabbing around making noise before 3. Lynch swung his bulk around to face her, outraged. Listen, we weren't making any. She stopped him with an explosive shh, advanced into the room, and aimed a stiff finger at his bed. Inside, boy. Slowly, he scraped off his slippers and climbed under the sheet. Miss Baldridge stood there watching him, hands on hips, ready to give the ultimate shout, You're on report, at the next sign of impertinence. She was a former Army major devoted to nursery discipline and critical of any nurse on her present staff, notably a pretty young blonde named Miss Kowarski, who called the patients Mister or listened to their complaints at any length, and she was in top form today. This morning she had commanded the radios to be silent while she paced the center aisle and delivered a lecture on luckiness to all the 20-odd men in the ward. If you had to get tuberculosis, she felt, you were lucky to have the Veterans Administration taking care of you, and luckier still to be in this particular hospital so close to New York, with its first-rate medical staff. Therefore, she had pointed out, her small eyes triumphant over the rim of her regulation linen mask, the least you could do was cooperate. Garvey, who was a former English instructor and spent most of his time reading, was singled out on 2 counts. The disorderly pile of books on his windowsill, he was lucky to be allowed any books, and the cigarette ashes on the floor next to his bed, he was lucky to be allowed to smoke. In most TB hospitals, it was against the rules. And though Garvey was unwilling to be contrite, he was equally unwilling to smile foolishly at her or to lose his temper, either of which would only have made it worse. There was no defense, he had decided grimly, just as there was no defense for this hulking, amiable stranger in the next bed who knew better than to come blabbing around before 3, and who now lay sweating on his back, controlling himself. There were no sounds except breathing, and beyond drawn Venetian blinds, the sound of insects charging the window screens, buzzing and bumping against them in a fury of frustration before they zipped away. Satisfied, Miss Baldridge turned on her rubber sole and started toward the door. Tune in tomorrow, said a low voice across the aisle, in the fruity tones of a radio announcer, for another heartwarming chapter in the life of Prue Baldridge, girl Army officer. She paused only for a split second in her prim departure, but that was enough to make it clear that she had been stung, then abandoned her impulse to attack in favor of a quick retreat, pretending she hadn't heard. As she neared the door, the voice became louder, joined now by a chorus of badly suppressed laughter from all over the ward. Can a girl soldier find happiness in a veterans hospital? It was Costello, an ex-salesman and former Air Force gunner, and he had scored a clean victory, a rout. The laughter rose jubilantly around him. He sat up in bed and went through the burlesque of taking a bow. "Thanks," Lynch called across the aisle in a stage whisper. "Don't mention it," Costello said, "any time." He was a slight dark man of 30 whose face was prematurely creased with laugh wrinkles. Though he had been here only a few months, his record of quitting or being expelled from one hospital after another dated back to the end of the war. Coyne, a big pimpled boy whose bed was next to Costello's and who always appreciated Costello's jokes, whether they were funny or not, was almost unconscious with laughter now. His face beet red, his bed trembling. At 3 o'clock, when Miss Baldridge reappeared to signal the end of quiet hour, he was still grinning. "Hey, Miss Baldridge," he asked her, "can a girl soldier find happiness in a veterans hospital?" "Oh, Coyne," she said, "for heaven's sake, grow up." And she began snatching open the Venetian blinds, admitting the blaze of afternoon. A moody attendant followed her, passing out a thermometer to each man, and Miss Kovarsky moved gracefully from bed to bed, taking pulses. "How are you today, Mr. Garvey?" Miss Kovarsky's voice was low, her fingers small and cool on Garvey's wrist. "Fine, thanks." She smiled at him, or at least her eyes narrowed above the white mask, and then she went on to Lynch's bed. In a minute, the radios were on again with the accounts of several ball games, and the coughing, laughing, and chattering of the ward was resumed. Most of the afternoon revolved around Lynch. It was necessary for those who knew him to welcome him back, and for those who didn't to assimilate him into the crowd. First, he was surrounded by the old-timers, elderly men who had lived in the admitting ward for years, and whose memories were long. After they had brought him up to date on hospital gossip, chuckling and scratching themselves with weak fingers, and while one of them, old Mr. Mueller, shuffled off to spread the news of his return through the other wards, Lynch exchanged names and information with Costello, Coyne, and some of the other younger men who had arrived since his time. Then Mr. Mueller came back with an enthusiastic group of ambulant patients, strangers to Garvey, some of whom wore convalescent uniforms of green cotton gabardine. They all said they were sorry to see Lynch back, and that it must be tough to be here in the admitting ward, right back where he had started from. And then they settled down to the talk of old times, of beer parties in the latrine, and of stolen visits. The wards were on the ground floor, and there were the fire exits in the latrines to neighborhood bars. They talked of innumerable good guys who had been kicked out, or were doing well or badly, or were as crazy as ever, or were over in surgery now, and one or two of good guys who had died. Garvey put on his glasses and began to read. Shortly before supper, Miss Baldridge scattered the crowd. "All right, get back where you belong, she said, "all of you." When they had gone, Lynch shook out a cigarette and offered the pack to Garvey. "How long you been here, Frank?" First names were almost never used in the admitting ward, and Garvey felt a surprising glow of pleasure at the boy's friendliness. 3 months, he said. "I'm just starting out." "You've been through the worst part," Lynch assured him. "I know that was the worst part for me. After that, the time goes by faster. You get used to the life. You get to know different guys. Any idea how long you'll be here this time? Have they told you anything?" "Told me I got a new cavity and I turned positive again, and that means they'll want to give me a lobe job. Probably keep me here on bed rest for 2 or 3 months, and then take me over to surgery. After that, there's no telling. A year, maybe more." A lobe job means a lobectomy, the removal of a section of lung and the ribs around it. That was all Garvey knew about it, except that it usually left a man with a partly crumpled chest and a perpetually half-shrugged shoulder, and that it often led to complications. There was some chance that Garvey's own disease might require surgery, and he didn't like to think about it. "Well," he said, "I certainly hope you make it soon. What did you say your first name was?" "Tom." During supper and for the rest of the evening they talked. If the time went by faster when you got to know different guys, Garvey decided it might be well to get to know them. They compared stories about the hospital staff, agreeing that Miss Baldridge was a tough customer, but that most of the other nurses and attendants were all right. The Lynch took exception to one of the night attendants, a small, roguishly effeminate man named Chansey, who, he said, had tried to make a pass at him once. I told him, "Look, Buster, if you want to play games, you picked the wrong boy, understand? I think you better keep out of my way from now on." Then they talked out of then they talked of the outside, and Lynch told about his father who had retired from the fire department, and his kid brother who wanted to be a professional middleweight. He asked Garvey about teaching, and said he had always wanted to go in for that kind of work himself. As a kid, he had thought about joining the Jesuits and later about qualifying for the regular Board of Education. But of course, it was too late now. What he should have done, he said, was use his GI Bill for college after the Navy, instead of fooling around as he had, working in a supermarket and playing semi-pro football on Saturdays, until the disease caught up with him. But it became increasingly clear as Lynch led up to the subject, touched on it, paused shyly and studied his cigarette, that what he really wanted to talk about was his girl. "I just started going with her when I was home this time," he said, after Garvey had helped him along. "Started to get pretty serious. I know it sounds corny, but I never knew I could get that crazy about any girl. She's all I think about all the time. I don't know. She's..." Gently he smoothed the sheet with the palm of his hand, finding perhaps that there were no words delicate enough for the thing he was trying to say. Then he grinned. "Anyway, all I want to do now is get married. Soon as I get out of here the right way with an arrested case, I'm going to collect that pension, maybe get myself some kind of easy part-time job, and then I'm going to get married. You're married, aren't you, Frank?" Garvey said he was, and that he had 2 children. Boys? Boy and a girl. "That's nice. A boy and a girl. They come here to see you?" "My wife does. They don't let the kids in. She'll be here tomorrow," he added. "You'll meet her, and maybe I'll get to meet your girl." Lynch looked up quickly. "No," he said. "She won't be coming here. That's impossible." "Too far?" "No, she just lives over in Jersey. It's not that. It's just impossible, that's all." There was an embarrassed pause. "Look, I'm not trying to be mysterious or anything, don't get me wrong. I'll explain it to you some other time." Awkwardly, they talked of other things for a while, and then Lynch got out his stationery box and began to write a letter. He was still working on it, tearing up the pages and starting them again when the lights went out at 10 o'clock, and he had to strike a match for light to put his writing things away. It must have been after midnight when Garvey was awakened by a harsh, repeated, strangely muffled sound. In his dream, it had been a dog barking far away. He opened his eyes and listened. It was the sound of weeping, desperately stifled as if by a pillow, and it came from Lynch's bed. Garvey was permitted to share the secret about the girl a week or so later, one evening when the climate was between them seemed right for confidences. And after that, for the rest of the long summer of waiting for Lynch's lobe job, the shared secret brought Garvey into a special kinship, gave him a special responsibility. He had seen it coming all through supper. When the trays were cleared away, Lynch came over to sit on the chair between their beds, and that was when it came out. "Look, Frank, this is just between you and me, understand? I figure I'll go nuts if I don't tell somebody." He drew the chair closer. "This girl I've been telling you about? It's Kovarsky." "Who?" "Miss Kovarsky. You know, the nurse." "Well, I'll be damned, Tom," Garvey said. "Congratulations. Now listen, don't let on about this, whatever you do, understand?" "Oh, hell, don't worry, I understand." "I started dating her after I got home," Lynch went on in his half-whisper. "I never messed around with her here. Thing is, see, there's some kind of regulation against nurses having personal contacts with the patients, and old Baldridge has it in for Mary anyway. She could lose her job if we're not careful. Hell, I wanted to tell everybody. I felt kind of proud about it, you know what I mean?" Garvey started to speak, but Lynch said, "Shh," for Costello was sauntering across the aisle, followed by Coyne. "Lynch, old man," Costello said, "we need a pair of pants. The lad here turned in his clothes like a good boy, and now he needs a pair of pants. You still got that suit in your stand, haven't you?" "Coyne?" Lynch said. "What the hell, Coyne, you mean you're going out?" Garvey was surprised too. This was old stuff for Costello, but Coin had been taking the cure conscientiously until now. And just for a couple of beers, Coin said, "We'll get back in time for the bed check at 11. "Well, look, Coin, you're welcome to the pants," Lynch said. "Whole suit if you want it, but I think I'd think twice about this going out crap if I were you. I mean, you go out tonight, then you'll want to go out tomorrow night, and pretty soon he'll be just like me," Costello broke in. "Right, Lynch? One foot in the grave and the other on a banana peel." He clapped Lynch on the shoulder and laughed. Coin laughed with him, self-consciously, and so did Lynch, shaking his head. Don't worry, Lynch, I'll take care of the lad. Bring him back just like new, and that's a promise. You got Professor Garvey here for a witness, right, Professor?" Then they had gone toward the latrine, Coin hugging Lynch's blue trousers furtively under his arm. Lynch shook his head again. "Guess I sound like some kind of an old lady, preaching that way, but that bothers me. I mean, a single guy, all right. Let him kill himself if he wants to, but Coin's married, and he's got a few responsibilities. I can't see it. And that goes for you too, you bastard. I catch you goofing off with that pretty wife of yours, I'll break your head." He laughed. "How about that? And I'm the guy that used to raise all the hell around here, on report all the time. But you see, that's what Mary's done for me. It's like I was married to her already." "That's fine," Garvey said, "except for the business of having to keep it a secret. Must be pretty hard to take when she's around every day." "It's not too bad. For one thing, she's not around every day. Half the time she works the other wards. And when she's here, we kind of wink at each other and whisper a little bit, like when she's giving me a sponge bath or something. And then we write a lot of letters, and I call her up when she's home. Not on this portable phone here in the ward. You get no privacy on that bastard. I use the booth down the hall, the one that's supposed to be for the staff. I wait till nobody's around, and then duck in there. It is a pain in the neck in some ways, though. Like this week, she's on the midnight to 8 shift. So a couple of nights ago, I thought I'd go into the nurse's office around 1, maybe get to see her alone. Jesus, 14 different guys coming in for sleeping pills and aspirins. We never had a chance. You gonna try it again? What's the use? Be the same story. Besides, I got no business running around after midnight. I'm taking the cure this time, and anyway, after tonight she goes back on days." He yawned and stretched his big arms, and then he leaned back with a reflective look. "Only thing that really bothers me is the way some of these wise guys talk about her. You know, the way a guy talks about a nurse. Boy, I'd like to get into her pants, stuff like that. Sometimes I want to stand up and say, 'Look, you bastards, lay off. That's mine.' You know what I mean?" After lights out, he went on whispering about his girl and their 5 months together. From the start, they had found they could sit for hours over a couple of beers just talking and have a wonderful time, which was something he'd never been able to do with a girl before. And there were times, long afternoons on a sand dune, for instance, and nights in the rich, dark secrecy of her parked automobile, when Lynch felt almost sick because he knew he had never been so happy. He had not taken her all the way, however. "I could have," he said. "I could have 20 different times. We were so close to it. I'm not saying that to brag or anything. I just mean I could have very easily. But I didn't. And I think that was one of the things she liked about me at first. I guess all the other guys she'd been out with had knocked themselves out trying for it, and she got fed up with that stuff. I said, 'Honey, I can wait. I know when something's worth waiting for,' and I think she liked that." Coin and Costello did not get back for the 11 o'clock bed check, but fortunately there were several other empty beds then, and many voices in the latrine, so the 5 to 11 nurse, Mrs. Fosdick, let it go with a familiar cry through the latrine door. "I want everybody out of there in 5 minutes." But when she came back again, just before her shift ended an hour later, she meant business. Her flashlight was trained on Coin's empty bed this time, and Lynch tried to cover for him. "Coin's in the latrine, Mrs. Fosdick." "Oh, yeah? How about Costello? I think he's in there too." "Well, they better be," she said, and the flashlight went away. Mrs. Fosdick was a squat, middle-aged widow who did her job exactly the way Miss Baldridge liked it, and everybody said she would be the next charge nurse if Miss Baldridge went back into the army. Coin, she called. Costello, you in there? There were muffled cries of, yeah, and sure thing. And a moment and a moment later, the two of them came into bed, giggling and weaving through the dark ward. Jesus, that was a close call, Coin whispered to Lynch, tiptoeing across the aisle. We just barely got in there, taking off our clothes when she comes to the door and hollers in. Oh, Jesus, I'm half loaded. He sat down on the foot of Garvey's bed and told them all about it, giggling and filling the air with his sharp breath. They had taken the bus to some gin mill about a mile down the road and started off with beer. But then they met these two broads, kind of old, he said, but not too bad, and Costello started buying shots all around. He's telling them his name's Costello and mine's Abbott, Coyne said. Jesus, that guy's a million laughs when he's half crocked. So anyway, here we are, drinking shots and having a big time, and all of a sudden I see it's 11 o'clock. I say, Jesus, Costello, we better shove off. He says, don't worry so much. Well, anyway, I finally get him out of there, and he tells the broads we'll be back at 12:30. So you're going out again? Lynch asked him. Sure. As soon as that little Polack nurse, what's her name, comes on duty. Kovarsky. Costello says he can fix it up with her. He stood up and peered across the dark aisle. Guess he's in the office now talking to her. Oh, Jesus, what a night. Then he loped over to his own bed and lay down to wait, and Garvey tried to sleep. But half an hour later, he heard someone stumbling around Lynch's bed again. Lynch, Coyne was saying, you awake? Yeah. Here's your pants. Guess we're staying in. What happened? My boy Costello. Now I can't get him out of the nurse's office. He's been in there for an hour. Got his arm kind of halfway around her, and every time I go to the door, he gives me this big wink and makes a sign for me to leave him alone. Guess he's really given her the business. Oh yeah? Lynch said, with what seemed to Garvey exactly the right degree of disinterest. How's he making out? Christ, Coyne said. I don't think he's getting to first base. Lynch put the pants away, turned over and settled himself for sleep. The next afternoon, he came back from a visit to the forbidden telephone booth with a confidential grin. I just heard all about Costello last night, he told Garvey. Said she couldn't get rid of him till almost 2. He was in there all that time trying to promote a date for himself. He cocked one foot on the chair and rested a forearm on his meaty knee. I got half a notion to take him aside and tell him he's wasting his time. Why don't you? I'm trying to keep this thing quiet, remember? The feet came down and he straightened his back, hitching up his pajama pants. First place, he'd never believe me, and in the second place, they'll find out soon enough if he keeps it up. She'll tell him if she has to. About a week later, his confidence seemed badly shaken. The portable ward telephone, coin-operated instrument on a wheeled platform that could be plugged in beside the beds, was a constant source of quarrels among the patients. Its users were always accused of hogging it. Costello began hogging it more than anyone else, but after the first few arguments, it became a standing ward joke, especially among the men on his side of the aisle, who started calling him Lover Boy. He would lie in bed and talk very low into the phone for an hour at a time, sometimes shielding the mouthpiece with his hand. You know who he's talking to, don't you, Frank? Lynch asked one evening, half smiling but looking annoyed. You know who he calls up all the time? Oh, hell, Garvey said. How can you be sure? Could be a different girl every night. Look, when I tried to call her last night, the line was busy until just about the time he got done over there. So tonight I listened real close when he made the call. It's her number he gave. You mean just from the sound of the dial? You can't tell anything from that. You don't dial numbers in Jersey. You give them to the operator. And it's her number he gave, right down to the J on the end. They both watched Costello mumbling and grinning into the telephone. Well, Garvey said, you'll notice he does all the talking. Oh, sure, I know that. I know he isn't making out or anything, don't get me wrong. Just makes me a little sore, that's all. I wonder what he talks about all the time. As soon as Costello hung up, Lynch walked out to the telephone booth. When he came back, he lay down and listened to his radio for a while. Then quite suddenly he snapped it off and came over to Garvey's bed. You know a funny thing, Frank? When I called her up, I said, just a little sarcastic, not sore or anything, I said, honey, You're a pretty busy girl. Didn't want to come right out and say I knew it was about Costello, you know what I mean? Might sound like I was jealous. And I figured she'd tell me about it, like she did before, but she didn't. Said it was her sister using the phone. So what could I say? Call her a liar? I don't know what the hell to think. I wouldn't worry about it, Garvey said. Probably just that she was afraid you might be jealous, might get upset over nothing. Well, yeah, Lynch said doubtfully. I guess you're right. He didn't want to talk about it anymore, and all the next morning he was silent and brooding until the mail came. But when he read the letter he received and it looked as though he read it several times, he seemed relieved and pleased. Garvey caught his eye. She still love you? Lynch smiled, half embarrassed and half proud, and said, yes, he guessed so. And that afternoon, when Mary Kowarski took the pulses after quiet hour, she gave Lynch a look that sent the color rising flagrantly in his thick neck. Even with the mask covering half her face, it was a look conveying all the reassurance in the world. Everything seemed all right then. Lynch had no further trouble getting his calls through, and Costello no longer hogged the portable telephone. Apparently he had given up. Any traces of doubt were removed a month later when it became evident that Costello had, as Coyne put it, gotten himself shacked up with something in the neighborhood, possibly one of the girls they had met that night in the bar, when Costello had been a million laughs. This was proven to Coyne by the fact that he had begun going out 3 or 4 nights a week, sometimes taking Coyne along, but always leaving him after the first few beers to go off alone. Soon he stopped taking Coyne altogether, and it was regularly reported that the headlights of a car came up to within 100 yards of the latrine's fire exit, where the car apparently picked Costello up and drove him away. Once he returned a white shirt he had borrowed from old Mr. Mueller, who held it up with comic chagrin to show it was smeared with lipstick. Damn shirt's been in my stand for 2 years, he whined, surrounded by laughter, and all I ever got on it was dust. And Coyne, examining Costello's bareback when he stripped to the waist in the heat of that same afternoon, swore he could see scratches, evidence that frenzied fingers had clawed him. Damn, boy, he said, she really must have given you the business. By now it was late summer, heavy and hot in the ward, except during visiting hours when the men would lie half naked on stripped beds, too hot to read or write or play cards, while the radios droned. It's a high fly ball out to left field. Woodling's under it and takes it to retire the side. Say, man, want a shave that leaves your face feeling like $1 million? Electric fans had been shelved at either end of the room, but their lolling wire faces barely stirred the sick room air, barely lifted and let fall the dangling corner of a sheet. In order to survive the afternoon, it was almost essential to have some promise of an evening's reward. So beer parties in the latrine had become more frequent, arranged by telephoning a local delicatessen whose delivery boy had standing instructions to wait outside the fire exit until a patient slipped out to meet him. It was on just such a day, with a party planned, that Lynch received his final letter in the afternoon mail. He came over to Garvey's bed with that odd, incongruous little smile that plays on the lips of the very shy when they announce a death. It's all over, Frank. She wants to call the whole thing off. Christ, Tom, what do you mean? Just like that? Out of a clear sky? Wasn't exactly a clear sky, he said. Seems that way now, but I guess I've known for a couple of weeks she was acting kind of funny. He broke off, as if bewildered, far from satisfied with what he had said. I don't know. It just don't sound natural. You want to read it? Not unless you want me to. Go ahead. You sure? Sure, I'm sure. Go ahead. See if it sounds natural to you. Mary Kowarski's handwriting was a blend of lifelessly even grammar school scripts and girlish affections. Some of her eyes were dotted with little circles. Dear Tom, I've been trying to write this letter for a long time, but I guess I was afraid. I'm not as brave as you are about a lot of things, but I guess the only thing to do is write it and get it over with. If we go on this way, one of us is bound to get hurt. I don't want you to call me up anymore or write me anymore letters, Tom. I've thought about it again and again until I think I will go crazy or something if I think about it anymore. And that is the way it's got to be. If I ever wanted to get married to anybody, it was you, Tom. But I guess I just don't want to get married. Not yet, anyway. I don't feel sure enough of myself. After tomorrow, I'm being transferred to one of the general medicine wards, so you won't be seeing me anymore, and I think that will make it easier. I will send your letters and your photo back, as I guess you will want them. You can throw mine away if you like. I wish you a lot of luck in getting well soon. Sincerely, Mary. The party shaped up at about 9. 2 cases had been ordered, and when Garvey and Lynch joined the group in the latrine, the delivery boy had just arrived. Coyne brought the first case through the fire exit door, and then old Mueller wrestled the second one inside. His scrawny back bent painfully. Costello gave him a hand, and they stowed both cartons in the shower stall, where they would be out of sight in case an angry nurse opened the door or an unfriendly attendant walked through. The parties always began the same way. After the hiding of the beer and a search for can openers, the first round of cans would be punctured with careful noiselessness, and the men would settle down to talk, very quietly at first, about the nurses on duty that night, whether they were good skates or could be counted on to make trouble. It was a big, ugly room of yellow-brown tile, staringly lighted by 2 big globes in the ceiling. The only places to sit down were the open toilet bowls that stood in the facing rows against 2 of the walls. 2 or 3 steel chairs from the ward that had been left here from previous parties, and an overturned wastebasket. Tonight it developed that a reasonably good skate, a Miss Berger, was on duty until midnight, but that they'd have to watch their step after that because old Fosdig had the 12 to 8 shift. Coyne did most of the talking. His chair tilted back against the tiles and his pajama pants hiked to the knee while he scratched a white leg. Hell, I don't think we got to worry about old Fosdick as long as we keep the noise down. She's been pretty good lately. You want to watch her, though, Costello said. She's all right as long as she thinks you're scared of her, but she won't take any crap. Well, Coyne said, grinning over at Garvey and Lynch, I guess our boy Costello's the expert on that subject, all right. God damn. Any of us tried raising the kind of hell he does around here, we'd be on report 5 times a week. Costello chuckled, pleased, and swilled the beer around in his half-empty can. It's all in knowing the angles, lad. Some things can't be taught, that's all. Lynch looked all alone, hunched on one of the toilet bowls in his faded pajamas, staring at the floor. He had eaten almost none of the supper, drank the coffee, and nibbled at the cake that was for dessert. That was about all. Garvey was trying to think of something to say, trying to get him to talk. What's the matter with old Lynch over there? Coyne demanded. He's sick or something? Got a slight case of TB or something? I think he needs a new beer, Garvey said. That's his trouble. By God, Professor, Costello said, that's my trouble too. And he went to the shower stall. By the time the first case was gone, the party had divided into 2 groups. Mueller and several other old-timers at one end of the room, comparing reminiscences of hospitals they had known, and Lynch, Garvey, Coyne, and Costello at the other end, talking up homosexuality. Garvey didn't know how the subject came up. He hadn't been listening to all of it. The beer had numbed his senses a little, and he had removed and wiped his glasses several times before he realized they really weren't misted. He was getting drunk. So when he said that, Coyne was saying, about coming up to his room, I figured, uh-oh, I don't want no part of this. So I told him no thanks. I had to go and I took off. But it was a funny thing. To look at him, you'd never think he was any different from you and me. It was the end of a long story, Coyne's contribution. Sure, Costello said, that's the way a lot of them are. Look and act just like anybody else. That's the kind you want to look out for, Lynch said. I hate them sneaky bastards. He bore down heavily on the opener, piercing a fresh can, and the foam slopped over his fingers onto the floor. No reason to hate him, Costello said, shrugging. Oh no? Lynch glared at him. He looked tough sitting there, his pajama top open across his chest, a tiny religious medallion swinging on its damp silver chain among the hairs. Well, I do. I hate their guts, every one of them. Like that Chansey bastard, that attendant. Remember Frank? I told you about him. Comes creeping around one night when I'm taking a shower, starts talking about how lonely the boys must get here, giving me that goddamn smile of his. You lonely, Lynch? He says. I told him, look, Jack, you want to play games, you picked the wrong boy. Think you better keep out of my way from now on. That's the only way to talk to them bastards. I hate them all. Oh, what the hell, Costello said. They're psycho cases, that's all. Oh yeah? Lynch said, oh yeah? Well, if you like him so goddamn much, I'll fix you up with Chansey. Costello laughed softly. Jesus, he gets nasty when he's drunk, doesn't he? I didn't know you were one of these nasty drunks, Lynch. I want everybody out of there in 5 minutes, Mrs. Fosdick called through the door. Okay, Mrs. Fosdick, Costello called back, just breaking it up now. The old-timers began tiptoeing to the shower stall to deposit their empty cans. Damn, Coyne whispered, we still got half a case in there. So, Costello said, yawning and getting to his feet, go in and lay down for a half an hour. Then come back and finish it up if you want to. Me, I'm going to sleep. Well, Christ, we can't let it go to waste, Coyne said. How about you, Garvey? I think I've had enough too. Lynch? What? Want to come back? Hell, Lynch said, I'm just beginning. They filed out and felt their way to bed in the darkness. Garvey lay down gratefully and closed his eyes, but opened them quickly when he felt a sudden rush of dizziness. For a long time it was necessary to lie with the pillow folded tight under the back of his neck and concentrate on the dim white outline of the foot of his bed. Whenever he closed his eyes or lost sight of the outline, the sickly dizziness returned. His concentration was so intense that he scarcely noticed when Lynch got up, whispering to Coyne, and the two of them went back to the latrine. Sleep settled over him in uneasy, fitful waves, each heavier than the last. He fought them off at first and then gave in, like a man drowning. Garvey. It was Coyne's voice, low and urgent. Garvey. Something was digging into his shoulder. Coyne's hand. The folded pillow was a painful lump under his skull, and there was another streak of pain over his eyes. Garvey! His mouth felt swollen, too dry for speaking. What time is it? He said at last. Jesus, I don't know. Coyne's voice had a sharp whiskey smell. About 4, I guess. 4? He said, trying to make it mean something. Listen, your boy Lynch is in bad shape. We've been out to a couple of gin mills, and he's loaded. Sitting in the latrine won't take off his clothes. You want to give me a hand with him? All right, Garvey said. He was fully awake now, moistening his lips. Be right in. Coyne hurried off, and Garvey sat up painfully, holding his head. He found his glasses on the bedstand and fumbled on the door for his slippers. The latrine light shocked his eyes, but in a moment he made out Lynch, slumped on one of the chairs in his blue suit, and Coyne hovering over him. Lynch looked terrible. His face shone bright red, the mouth loose and wet, and the eyes filmed over. Come on, boy, Coyne was saying. Let me take your coat off. Oh, leave me alone. Leave me alone, will ya? Lynch tossed his head and pushed Coyne's hand away from his shoulder. There's old Frank. What do you say, Frank? Listen, Frank, tell this son of a bitch to leave me alone, will ya? Okay, Tom, Garvey said. Take it easy now. Coyne took one lapel of Lynch's coat and Garvey the other, but Lynch tightened his arm. Leave me alone, goddammit. Both you bastards, leave me alone. Keep your voice down, Tom, Garvey said. They managed to work the coat down around his elbows when suddenly he stopped resisting. His eyes fixed glitteringly on the latrine door. Garvey looked up. Chansey, the night attendant, had just come in, blinking under the lights. The linen mask hung loose under his chin, revealing a childish mouth. Well, Lynch said, speak of the devil. Somebody speaking to me? Chansey asked in mock concern, and then he smiled knowingly at Garvey. Look, do you gentlemen want some help? No thanks, Garvey said. We can handle him. Lynch glared at the attendant. Thought I told you. Keep out of my way. Oh, he's really blind, isn't he? Chansey said, smiling. He looked very small, very blond and pale in his white duck uniform. Thought I told you, keep out of my way. Coyne told Lynch to take it easy, and Garvey said, you better leave, Chansey. But Chansey didn't move. Lynch's eyes were slits. Give me that goddamn smile. Get that goddamn smile off your face and get out of here. Get out of here, you fairy bastard. Oh, now, Lynch, Chansey said, taking a step forward. You don't mean that. Before they could grab his arms, Lynch whipped out of the coat sleeves, sprang across the floor, and drove his big right fist into Chansey's neck, just under the ear. Chansey crumpled quickly, but Lynch's left caught him in the face before he sprawled to the floor. Coyne had one of Lynch's arms now, and Garvey seized the other, pulling back on it with all his strength. In the unfamiliar shock of effort, Garvey's arms and shoulders burned. The muscles fluttered in his thin invalid's legs. Lynch's voice was a high child's whimper. Let me go, I'll kill him. Chansey groped to his feet, holding his red blotched face just as the blood began to course from his nose and dribble on his uniform. For Christ's sake, get out, Garvey yelled, but he stood there absurdly smiling through the blood, and said, let him go, it's all right. It couldn't have been that he wanted to fight. It seemed almost that he wanted to be hurt. Lynch advanced on him with a terrible struggling slowness, locked against Garvey and Coyne, but pulling them along, while Garvey's slippers slid and scribbled on the tiles. Let him go, Chansey said again. Lynch broke from Garvey first, freeing his arm with a lunge that sent Garvey's glasses flying, and then he twisted away from Coyne. Whimpering and sobbing for breath, he seized Chansey's arm, wrenched it, swung him around like a flail, and sent him crashing against the wall. Then he fell on him, sank one knee into his belly and both blunt thumbs into his throat. They had just hauled him off when Mrs. Fosdick burst in, wide-eyed, and said, What's going on here? For an instant they all froze under her shocked eyes. Chansey half risen against the tile wall, Lynch squatting spread eagle in the arms of Garvey and Coyne. Then Coyne sat down. Garvey picked up his broken glasses, and Lynch stumbled over to one of the toilets and began to vomit. I've got to have a doctor, Chansey said in a tight, breathless voice. I think my arm is broken. It was all over then. The rest of the night, or morning, fell into the inevitable sequence of aftermath. The attendants taking Chansey away to the emergency ward. Mrs. Fosdick stumping around with her flashlight, ordering them to bed, and then hurrying back to put it all into the report. The hours of lying there in the dark. Lynch lying quietly with a Kleenex wrapped around his raw knuckles and the red coal of a cigarette illuminating his eyes. I'm sorry about the glasses, Frank. And finally the turning on of the ward lights at 7 o'clock, and Costello scrubbing his eyes and looking around with a sleepy grin. Jesus, what was all that commotion last night? Breakfast, then, and the fresh starch, the early morning efficiency of Miss Baldridge. Lynch, that was the most disgusting exhibition I've ever heard of. You better start packing your things, because you can be sure the doctor will want you out of here and on the bus before noon. But Lynch was not kicked out, to everyone's surprise. The doctor gave him a severe dressing down, and that was all, and then went into a conference with the other doctors, after which Lynch was removed from the ward and placed in one of the quiet rooms, single-bed cubicles reserved for the very sick, to spend the remaining weeks until he would be taken to surgery. Miss Baldridge was plainly dumbfounded and assured everyone that Lynch had been inordinately lucky, that it was only because his case was of unusual interest to the surgeons, which was probably true. For days there were conflicting rumors on what had become of Chansey, the most authoritative being that his arm had been sprained, not broken, and that after treatment he had been returned to duty on a different ward. Coyne and Garvey were cleared from the report by Lynch's testimony that both had come into the latrine only after the trouble began, though Coyne made sure that everyone in the ward knew the real story, which he told with relish long after the men had stopped asking to hear about it. Soon, except for the fact that Lynch was gone, everything seemed just about the same in the ward. At least that was the way Garvey described it to Lynch whenever he went to the quiet room to visit him. How's everything in the ward? Lynch would ask, lying very flat and still. He seemed to lie like that for hours in his tiny room, reading nothing, looking at nothing, talking to no one, except during these brief, awkward visits. All he apparently did was finger the cord of the Venetian blind that dangled near his pillow. It was stained a sweaty gray from handling. Oh, just the same, Tom, Garvey would say. Same dull business. Got a new man in your bed, an elderly guy. Coin's going out a lot lately, 3 nights so far this week. How about Costello? Still got that shack job of his? Cars still come around for him all the time? Seems that way. Nothing's really changed since you left. And that broadly was the truth, since no one but Garvey could see any connection between Lynch's departure and the fact that Costello had begun hogging the portable telephone again. Only Garvey, lying across the aisle and listening, could find it significant that he began each call by reciting a New Jersey telephone number ending in J, and that his half of the ensuing conversation, more careless and confident than before, contained sentences like, "Be around tonight, honey?" and "Sure I do, baby. You know I do." Lover boy, they called him.